how Paul's transitioning from this big idea of having a church and what that looks like to smaller relationships, and specifically, oh, Christina, you clicked on something. Okay, specifically last week we talked about husbands and wives. We talked about how that relationship is reciprocal. We talked about how you actually have to be in relationship in order to submit. In this context, right? If you are married and you are more living with a roommate, right? There's no submission going on because you guys don't care about one another, and we kind of dove into that, and then somewhat, yeah, and then we are going to go more into now just like household instructions and other relationships. And I think the important thing to keep in your mind this morning as we go get into this is Paul is specifically talking about the relationships that you have within your house. And he's not talking to the world, he's talking to Christians in the church. He's talking to Christians in the church about relationships you might have either at your house or on your property. All right, so that's a quick review. Oh, okay, so before we move on, yes, Ken, what's my question? So I'm going to show you guys a series of pictures. I'm going to pause on the picture just maybe for 5 seconds. I just want you to absorb it, okay? Just absorb the picture. And I have, let's see here, I have 1, 2, 6, 8. I have 8 pictures that we're going to look at. So just look at the picture, absorb it, and then I'll move on to the next one, okay? And then I'll ask you the question after we're done looking at the pictures. All right, here we go. All right. If you had to summarize those 8 pictures, what would you say I just showed you? Sorry, Mike? Progression of life, anybody else? Stages? Growth? A growing family? Yeah, socialization. All right, so those are all correct. Congratulations. You all got enough sleep? I don't know how that happened. Not because I don't think you can't sleep, back to the whole time change thing. Anyway, yeah, so stages of life is how I defined it, which is synonymous with everything that you guys all said. So when we look at the stages of life, here are the actual descriptions of the 8 stages that I showed you guys. Yeah. So we have infancy, toddlerhood, preschool years, early school years, adolescence, young adulthood, middle adulthood, and late adulthood. All right, so my question is, what's going through your brain right now? I want to know. What, Becky? Well, yeah, see, these descriptions are not to scale. And what I mean by that is I'm in middle adulthood, and I had the same reaction. I was like, man, I'm at the end of my life too. Anybody else? What's going through your mind? Corinna? And most of those? All right. She is leaving a legacy. Anybody else? Jeff. Okay. I don't think you're alone in that. I would have to say my mind is probably closer to adolescence than it probably should be. Eric? Okay. Todd? Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes, that is very good. Melinda? Learning. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Gay? Very good. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. I love your guys' responses. Do we have anybody else? This is all really good. You've been listening. Yes. Yeah. Very good. Mitch? Yeah. I'm not at adolescent. Am I on now? Oh, there we go. Okay. Yes, an outline of our Christian development. Okay. So, one last question is, was there one you didn't like? Christina, why didn't you like adolescence? I know, right? My voice squeaked. Anybody get that? I know. Come on, guys. We were there, weren't we? Who wants to go back to that? Early school years? Okay. Which one did you love when if you're looking at that? I asked Tara this morning and she said right now. And then I asked her, I didn't get to ask her, but I wanted to ask her, which one do you think we're in? But because I didn't show her all the pictures. But who would say you love where you are right now? That's very healthy. And I think Paul brings that out, or I'm going to try and bring that out this morning in what Paul is talking about. So open up your Bibles to chapter 6. And before we get there, I just want to, we kind of talked about these, but what stage are people the easiest to love? What stage are people the easiest to build a relationship with? What stage are people the easiest to plan a future with? What stage are people the easiest to look to work alongside? I think I think this might be kind of what Paul is getting at and recognizing that because as we walk through this Christian life, we have a spiritual stage. And I think that spiritual stage is a little hard for us to understand. And I think the biggest reason it's hard for us to understand is because your spiritual stage does not match your life stage very often. Does that make sense? Does everyone know what I mean by that? Who in here became a Christian when you were an infant? Nobody? That's what I mean, right? So our Christian spiritual stage begins when we're in a life stage that's longer down the road. For you, maybe. For someone else, maybe it began at late adulthood. Does that make sense? And so that's part of the reason why Paul is talking about, hey, this is how you need to act in your home, is because he recognizes that this is something that we're all on a different path. Okay, so Ephesians 6, 1 through 3. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth. Okay, so what is the wrong thing for children to do? I would say dishonor or disobey, right? What's the right thing for them to do? Obey. Are children born and ingrained with this knowledge? So when Paul says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right, who has to teach them how to obey? Parents. Oh. What does he mean by honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise? Love and respect. Yeah? Right. So, Alan, will you go there? Deuteronomy 5:16. And while he's going there, when we talk about honor, sometimes I think the best way to define a word is, what is it not? That's what's easy for me. Because sometimes definitions of words can be a little bit ambiguous, and maybe we all have a little bit of a different definition, but we all know what honor isn't, don't we? So, what is the opposite of honor? What does that look like? Anti everything? Rebellion? I'm sorry? Bringing shame? Okay. Jump when you tell you to do something. Dana? Not caring. Yeah. So are kids really easy about doing those things that we just talked about? I think the answer to that is yes. And I think the reason why kids are easy about doing that is because we're all selfish. And one of the things that is really important to teach young children is this idea of not to be selfish. The world is bigger than you. And so when we talk about honor, honor is something that always is done outside of your own self. You have to honor somebody else. Well, in order to honor somebody else, you obey, right? So there's a cause and effect relationship in order to have honor come out of it. Does that make sense? Okay, Alan, go ahead and read that for us. All right. So this is commandment number what? Is it 6 or is it 5? I think it's commandment number 5. The first 3 were all about how we live with God. The fourth one was remember the Sabbath, which is also with God. And number 5, which is so interesting, is it says it's the first one. Oh, first one with the promise. You know what is so interesting about this? Well, I just talked about cause and effect, right? This is the first commandment listed in Deuteronomy that says, if you do this, this will happen. In Deuteronomy, when he lists the 10 commandments. Now, he says that often and how he wants you to love the Lord your God. But actually, in the written commandments in Deuteronomy, when he lists them out, the 5th one is the only one that says, and you will have a long life on the earth and the land that is promised, or that I'm giving to you. Ken? Yes. Mm-hmm. Right. So that's my next question, Ken, is what do you think the age group is? No, that's not a good way to phrase it. Let's phrase it this way. When are you no longer a child? When you have your own kids, when your parents have died, always a child in the eyes of the Lord. Okay, Lori, did you have one? Okay, left the household of your parents. Okay, so I mean, my dad's in here. I'm his child. May make me a little queasy, but it's true. Um, so we have our parents, some of us, for a long time while we're on this earth. When do you no longer honor them? Until death, even after they're gone? Ben? Hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Right. There is a difference. Yeah. Dana. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. So I'll get to you in a second here, Vance. But let me ask a question in regards to Dana's comment. How would you define the nuclear family here in Billings, Montana? Right? How do we define it? Anybody want to take a stab at that? Lori? Those that live in your home, mother, father, children. So that goes back to what Dana was talking about. How our American culture, especially, we don't really our family are those that are in our household. That's really how we look at it. Um, Not to say that other people aren't our family, but there's a different type of relationship with those that we live with and those that we don't. Isn't that true? So when this was given, this commandment, where were the Israelites? Where were they? In the desert. Were there only children walking around? Were there some people maybe that were in young adulthood stage of life? Late adulthood stage of life? Adolescence stage of life? He gives this command at one time to just the people that have children. He gives this commandment at that time when they're wandering around in the desert to everybody. He is telling everyone, honor your mother and father. Does that make sense? I think sometimes we lose that, and it goes back to what Dana said. Number one, all culture is a little weird, especially with how we treat our parents when they get old. They make a home for you. Um, Not sure that that's the intent. I'm not sure that that even there's a question. We won't get into that, but is that honorable? You know, like we can ask all those questions. Vance, did you have something? Hmm. Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So that's perfect because that goes back to what Ben was talking about, and it brings us back to our stages of life, right? That we talked about in the beginning. Okay, let's move on. Um, Next, verse 4. Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. All right. So first thing I want you to do is I want to teach you guys something. If you hadn't already known, I kind of figured this out by accident. But how many people are using the Bible on your phone this morning? Some of you. Okay. If you're using the Holy Bible app, the brown one or whatever, you go to verse 4 and you just click on verse 4 and it'll highlight it with a bunch of dots underneath it. And then underneath that, where the tab comes up, you can hit compare, and it'll bring up a bunch of other different verses or versions of the same verse once you hit compare. So when we talk about exasperating, right? Fathers, do not exasperate your children. I really was struggling. What did Paul mean when he said this 2,000 years ago? Because what he means by exasperate is probably different than the way we use it now. Right? So, did I teach anybody anything about your phones? All right, perfect. I'm glad I did because I found that out by accident. So, if you scroll down there and you have the New Living Translation, I'm going to read the New Living Translation of this verse, and it says, "Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger by the way you treat them. Rather, bring them up with discipline and instruction that comes from the Lord." Now, to me, that's much easier to understand what Paul meant. What Paul was meaning was this idea of not provoking your children to anger by the way that you treat them. So before we dive into that, I want to ask a quick question. Is he only talking to fathers? Parents. Raise your hand if he thinks he's talking to parents. Okay, raise your hand if you think he's just talking to fathers. Okay. Is he excluding mothers from not acting this way? So I think it's important for us to realize what Paul is saying and what he's not saying. So he may say fathers, and if you've ever learned a different language, you know that language within its roots has male and female terms, male and female root words. And so when you look at the word father, like I took Spanish, and everything has a male and female root term and root way to understand it. And so there's a lot lost in the translation of other languages because the English language doesn't really have male female root terms like lots of other languages do. So there's a great debate on whether or not he specifically says only fathers or whether or not he's talking to parents. I don't want to get into that debate, but what I do want to make known is he's not giving mothers like a green light. Say, go ahead, provoke your children all day long to anger. Okay? He doesn't say that. He doesn't say, mothers, don't worry about it, you're okay. So even if he is just talking to fathers, we have to remember he is not excluding mothers to have this advantage, I guess. So I would say parents. Now, what's so interesting about do not exasperate your children, do not provoke your children to anger. When do they say that the brain stops learning or growing, I guess? Does anybody have an idea? 25? That kind of lines up with something else. Renting cars. What did you say, Lori? Having children? Yeah. So if you're going to define children, what age group do you think Paul is talking about here when he says, fathers, do not exasperate your children? Do you think he's talking about the relationship that my dad and I have, how he's my dad and I'm his child? He could, maybe. See, that's what is really difficult for us to understand. We go back to who was he talking to when God gave the Ten Commandments? Well, he was talking to all of them. Honor your father and mother. Well, Paul here is writing to a church in Ephesians. If we go back to our life stage and we compare it to our spiritual stage, and he's saying, fathers, do not exasperate your children. I think if we try to define this as, okay, he's talking about like primary age, right? It's got to be, or maybe back to toddler to primary. Like maybe adolescence, maybe not, definitely not middle adulthood. No way. I think we can really get ourselves into trouble. Alan? Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's a great question. And now to add to that question, I want you guys' response. Is Paul talking about the spiritual stage of life or the physical stage of life? Which one? He's talking about both. But does the spiritual stage of life line up with the physical stage of life? We talked about that, right? Dana? Yes, it does. Right. Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, so what Dana just said is my conclusion for our class today about how this whole instruction that Paul gives about the Christian household all begins in chapter 5, verse 21. He says, submit to one another. So if we use the context of that and we talk about fathers, do not exasperate your children, I think what we have to realize is that he's talking about something that is difficult for us to understand, and we probably don't think of it first, but it's every stage of life with every spiritual stage of life. Fathers, don't exasperate your children, but instead instruct them in the training of the Lord. Because while you may not match up with your physical stage of life and spiritual stage of life, we all have a father. And Paul's hope is that our father is doing what he can, just like God is our father, to instruct us in the way of the Lord. Did I see a hand, Steve? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, right. Yeah. And and that reminds me of why I asked the question, when does your brain stop learning or growing at 25? I would say that when it comes to instruction, there's a lot of physical life teaching that goes on before 25. But this training and instruction of the Lord, when does that happen? Until your last breath, right? So I think it's important for us to realize that these relationships, we still have them. We still have fathers. And like Lori was saying, even though our fathers may be gone, we can still honor them. And this idea of provoke to anger is the only thing that really leads me to think that, okay, maybe Paul is also saying, okay, you will have little kids and you have a responsibility if you have little kids. That leads me to this, right? We talked about how he's talking to parents. Is parent a noun? Maybe. So a father or mother, a forefather or ancestor, right? that goes back to the conversation we had. What is the nuclear definition? How do we act in America compared to other cultures and countries, a forefather or ancestor? But is parenting, oh, I just said it. Be or act as a parent. So when Paul says, do not provoke your children to anger, what is Paul recognizing by saying that statement? Don't act like a child to your child. Yes, Melinda. Yeah. Yep. So what we need to understand is that there's a responsibility that parents have. And Paul says it here that if you're a parent, your responsibility is to train. And he goes further and says, I want you to train how? In the instructions of the Lord, right? And remember, that doesn't end when your children become adolescents, when your children become young adults, when your children become middle adults, when your children become later adults. I won't use the word old, don't worry. Becky or Cliff? Yeah. It's not done by accident. Is it work? Is being a parent work? Is it hard work? Is it easy to get lazy as a parent? I think so. Ben? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we'll touch on that at the end of class too. But I got 10 more minutes, so I'm gonna have to move on. Now we're gonna read Ephesians 6:5-8. But what I want to remind us of real fast is what I said a couple minutes ago when I said the audience of this church in Ephesus. How many of them do you think had late adulthood parents living with them in their house? Over 50%? Yeah, most of them. So how many of those households do you think spanned three or greater generations? I would say most of them, right? Because we have parents, we have kids, parents, grandparents, maybe even great grandparents living in the same house. So Paul is giving instructions, we need to remember, to Christian households, to people who profess Jesus as their Savior and their Lord. And he's saying, this is how I want you to be in relationship with people that live in your house. He is not saying, these are the types of relationships I want you to have with people. He's saying, if they're living in your house, this is how I want you to treat them. Does that make sense? Because when we read this, some people get the wild idea and the wild, crazy thought, oh, Paul's saying slavery is okay. No. Paul is recognizing that on your property, in your house, it's possible you might have a slave. And there's a certain way he wants you to treat that person. That's what Paul is talking about. Slaves, Ephesians 6:5-8. Obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward each one for whatever good deed they do, whether they are slave or whether they are free. And then verse 9, And masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. What is Paul saying about relationships within the house by adding slaves to this conversation? Mm-hmm. Why were there slaves in the household if they were Christians? Why doesn't he come out and say, don't have slaves if you're a Christian? Their livelihood, their culture. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Whole different mindset. Um, right. Right. Ben. Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, who else did that? We read the Beatitudes not too long ago. The Beatitudes is not Jesus saying, I want you to be meek. I want you to be poor in spirit. That's not what Jesus is saying on the Sermon on the Mount when he talks about the Beatitudes. He says, hey, I'm going to meet you wherever you are. So if you happen to be meek at this point, if you happen to be poor in spirit, I'm going to meet you there. And I'm going to bless you in that spot. And that's exactly what Paul is saying here as Christians. He is taking the word, he is taking Jesus to society, and instead of trying to change society, he's trying to change who? People. He's trying to change people. That's the message and the focus. Because when we look at Jesus' example, oh, I'm going to skip this. Okay, this is what Dana talked about earlier, how we need to submit to one another, this whole conversation. Um, Jesus is in heaven and he's Lord of us all. Did Jesus have relationships? Did Jesus try to change society around how he wanted to have a relationship? No, he didn't. Did Jesus go through stages with his relationships? This is what Ben was talking about earlier. And I think this is the life application for us right now is love people as they progress and recognize that as people are progressing, their spiritual life stage most likely is not adding up to their physical life stage. It's not likely they're the same. So if Paul was writing to modern day America, I think his statement might be something like this. Children, love your kids when they're infants. Love them when they're toddlers. Love them when they're primary, adolescents. Love them as they grow. Love each stage. Adults, love your parents through each stage. And you may be on a different spiritual stage than your parents, but take Jesus to them and treat them how Jesus would. I think that's Paul's life application because we don't live in this Christian household mindset. If we try to apply, oh, this is how I treat people in my house, we're going to miss what Paul's really saying because we have relationships that are very different now than they were 2,000 years ago. They probably didn't even have the phrase acquaintance. We have coworkers, bosses, supervisors, people at the checkout stand because we go to Albertsons all the time. And when we see Joe in line 2, we go, even if the line's really long, because we have a relationship, right? We have an acquaintance with that person. That, I think, is a life application. I saw a hand. Yes, Joshua. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Hmm. Right. And I think the reason why it was successful is because Jesus is much better at this idea of submit to one another than we are. And that's the Dana's conclusion. Oh, Dwayne. Yeah. Hmm. Yep. Yeah. There was a relationship there that was bigger spiritually than what society was providing. All right, Mitch, you'll be our last comment. Make it good. Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Recognize that goes back to my statement when I said love everyone where they are, because that's what Jesus did. He didn't matter where you were. He said, I'm going to bless you where you are. And the difficult thing that we have when it comes to relationships is it's relationships are hard. What makes it easy if we try and treat every relationship the same? Then it's easier on us, but is that the right thing to do? I don't think so. I think we need to meet people where they are, and that's where we take Jesus. All right, thank you guys.